Hey, welcome to another episode of Ask.
Mom and Dad. Dad and Mom. One of the two.
Well, yeah.
Which
I give you,
you go
top
first
billing
because
because
you're
your
kinda
alphabet. We're going backwards in the
head
alphabet.
of the household. So you could say Dad and Mom. Oh, okay. Well,
See?
it would be Dad and Mom.
Yeah, well, I'm
Why are we
also,
going
as we learned last time, I'm highly considerate of women and want to listen to what they have to say and take them very seriously
Oh, that's
by
cool.
by totally not catching what you said. So Jesus listens to everybody and values people all.
Yes, he
I
does.
may forget to
Yeah,
value
you
you
might.
now and again.
You might miss
Goodness. So last time we were talking about calling. Let's just get into it before I get into any more water. That's
Okay.
and just, you
Sounds
ever had
good.
that moment where you're in the surf and you're
Yeah,
walking
you're
out and
doing
you're
that
thinking,
right
oh, it's
now.
so nice out here. I'm in the surf. The waves are good. And then all of a sudden you're underwater because it just dropped right off. No, I've done that a few times. It's scary. So I'm sorry. Anyway, we're talking about calling. And yes, we're going to just keep rolling. And last time we talked about the obvious calls. And I said I would begin this time by starting my story. You told a little bit about what it was become to answer that original call, which is where Christ calls us to himself.
Yeah.
And that we call that conversion or salvation. When we first become aware of the fact that there's a God that's calling us, that's pursuing us, and accept that calling. We hear that. Paul tells us that how can we hear without a preacher? And so we hear that oftentimes through preachers or family members. People, the preach means to proclaim the word.
Yeah.
So someone who tells us the story, tells us who Jesus is. Book of
puts a
Deuteronomy
seed of
reminds
faith.
us that that's something that should be in every family, is passing that story on from family to family.
Right.
You talked about your mom and your family and how you were 5 when you became a follower of Jesus, and how that was reinforced at home. I don't want to say that my parents didn't reinforce Christianity at home. It was. We went to church every single Sunday, except for alternating Sundays when my dad's NFL tickets allowed us to take turns to go to home games. You got to get your religion priorities right? And so
Apparently, if you live in Atlanta anyway. Right?
I did, yeah. It really wasn't a very religious experience to go to Falcons games in the 80s, just to be real clear about that. It gave you an emotional rush, which we're going to talk a little bit of emotional rush sometimes, but most of it was disappointing. Let's just say it that way.
Yeah,
and
okay.
I'm still not a Cowboys fan. Even living in Texas, I just couldn't bring myself to love the Cowboys after watching what they did to my Falcons all those years. The point that I'm getting at is my family, I would say, we're Christians, but I think also by some standards we might call it more of a nominal existence, in the sense that we went to church, but if we were going to get spiritual teaching, it was going to be at church. As my dad passed away when he was 54, same age I am now, and he had cancer, and it took his life by August of the year he turned 54, and so there were some periods of time in that time frame of his coming to realize that the end was coming, that he really rapidly grew to understand more what it was to think more about the long term. It's just interesting how that can happen with us sometimes.
Yeah. Of eternity when you're facing it.
For me as a child, I went to church all the time. It was just something we did. We went on Wednesdays, we went on Sundays, went on Sunday nights, and my mother.
Because your mom played the piano.
My mom played the piano, so she was
Organ.
both there because she wanted to be there, because she didn't always play the piano, but she was also there because that was where her social circles were. That's where she was doing good in her community. It's just something our family did in that generation. My mom and dad were a little older than yours. Yours are more boomers. My mom was what you call the silent generation. So there's a whole lot of that linger of just, you do what's right because it's right to do.
Yeah, I was going to say, you also grew up in the South, and legitimately the Bible Belt, where it is a part of their culture. They go because that's what you're supposed to do.
Did you just say you weren't born in the South?
Well,
my dad didn't think you were. My dad said they just think they're Southerners.
Whatever.
Yeah.
I grew up in the southern part of Missouri. That's all I'll give you. I'm not really. It was very Midwest. I've learned since that it was very Midwest, but also we had a lot of the culture of the Bible Belt, but not necessarily the same sense. And in reality, like we've learned since we've married, there was a sense of, to me, a little bit more of a depth of that because of maybe the spreading out toward the west. They're farmers, whatever. They had to kind of live in understanding of almost testing God, not in a sense of testing him, but living him, proving himself to them. Because my grandfather was a a farmer and lived off the land. And that's all I'm trying to say is I think it proved God a little bit more to them. They lived a real, more closely. I'm not even trying to down your family. I'm just saying that I think in some cultures, especially in urban cultures, it was a more of a habit of what you're supposed to do.
Well, and you touch on
as opposed to
something
you
important,
might
even
have
more so than,
experienced.
I'm sorry to shut you down.
No, that's right.
Even more importantly, though, I think is the difference between an urban and a rural family.
Yeah,
I was raised in Atlanta, Georgia, or north of Atlanta, in a little town called Roswell, and I was really proud of that town. And it had about 30,000 people in it, but it was metropolitan hub of Atlanta. It was outside the perimeter, but it was still, and it was a Civil War town. It was one of the few towns that didn't burn down. That didn't get burned down in the torching towards Atlanta, the march during Sherman's March. I think that march, did Sherman's March start where Grant was located in Missouri? No, it didn't. But just pointing out that Missouri is not in the South. That's
nope.
Can't make Civil War jokes because that's bad.
Yeah. No, but proudly neutral territory is what Missouri was.
Yeah, Missouri was like, come on through. There was a lot of beautiful old homes and a lot of old history. Not all good, not all bad. There was a lot of, but it was still very much a city living. So I was a city boy, and we even joke that therefore I'm more technologically oriented because the city's technology. No, just because I like tech, and you've got a Bible open on the table. I have a iPad open on the table. Both have Bibles, but one is on a timeline because of the battery. But the other anyway. So my upbringing was different. All of that rambling aside. So we were there. I was there a lot. And honestly, for me, my heroes were the ministers of the churches. I felt like these were people who knew what they were doing with their lives and their worlds. And
I remember you saying that the youth minister really did affect you. His life was, well, I would have remembered if you wouldn't have asked because you've talked about him so much.
I can tell you the name of several ministers that came across my path, but it was youth minister. There was, it was a big church, so there was youth ministers. There was the associate pastor of administration. There was the pastor of education. I was a singer, so the music ministry of the church was really a big deal to me. Yeah. I went on mission trips, which I'm going to get to that were rooted out of the music ministry. That was my favorite ones to go on. We'd go away and we'd learn a song or musical in a week, and then we'd come back and perform it at church. I wasn't the jock; I was the musician. But I was briefly a jock. But the church for me was something we did because it was part of our culture to begin with. The message of Jesus began to take hold in me and make sense to me right around the time I hit puberty. And probably because it's such a confusing time anyway. But I was sitting in classes and listening to my Sunday school teachers and my buddies, and I was wanting to fit in really, really bad. But what's interesting about that is every teenager wants to fit in with their peers. And I did struggle with that. But I really wrestled with the sense of who Jesus was and what he wanted from me or what he wanted. Yeah, well, at that point in life, that's all I could figure it out, right? Yeah. I always had a sense of the presence of God. I always talked to God. I can still remember some of those weird times, and I just always kind of knew God was there. And I never felt like he didn't answer prayers just because I couldn't hear his voice audibly. I just knew he was there. There was just no question. You talked a little bit about this last week, about how children kind of can sense, can see. And I don't remember any of that, but I just wonder if sometimes when I was really, really young, when I was 5 and 8 or somewhere in there, if I was just aware enough of the presence of God that it rooted in me. Because I just don't have a time in my life where I question the existence of God, other than that brief flash now and again that just comes across like, what if it's wrong? And then it's gone as quick as it's there.
Yeah.
Because it's like my mind knows better. My heart knows better. There's something that's going, what if that's the dumbest thing I ever just thought? It's like, and not to mention, it's not a great comfort to know that God's there. It's a great bet to say, what have I got to lose? If I'm wrong, I'm just gone. Exactly. I'm going to put my faith in something that I don't want to be wrong about. So anyway,
that will matter.
I was wrestling with it. And so there was a point, and I just remember the preacher preaching and giving us an opportunity to respond. And I do remember, remember getting out from the pew and walking down the middle aisle. Well, there was 2 aisles. I walked down the right middle aisle and met the pastor, Seymour, at the front of the church and told him I wanted to receive Jesus. And we prayed together. And because I was 12, I was called immediately that Monday, my mom got a call and I had to have a meeting with the pastor. It scared me to death. I mean, do you know how big conference tables look when you're 12? And so I went to the church. I don't remember the day of the meeting, and I do. I'm telling you, the chairs looked like they were mammoth.
Huge,
and I just, to this day, those images are there, and I go in the same conference. The church has been there, and I don't think they've got a new conference table. The last time I was there was probably 7 years ago or plus.
And it was 7 miles long.
But I walked in there, I'm looking at it going, this isn't that big. And, but I went into this room, and the pastor came in to meet me, also seemed big, and sat down in the chair, and he walked me through everything, and he just wanted to make sure. I thought I was in trouble, but because that's just where I lived.
Yeah,
I still kind of live there. So he says, "Can we talk?" And I'm like, "Crap, what do I do?" Well, I'm way too old for that, but it's still a thing. So, the pastor said, "Let me walk you through this process," and he asked me if I understood what it meant to be a follower of Christ, and I said yes. And then he said. He basically walked me through the plan of salvation again to make sure I understood what it was to make a decision to answer the call. And I somehow or another managed to convince him that I was serious. I wasn't just walking out because it was an emotional moment.
Or because other youth were doing it or something.
Or because, there wasn't any other youth doing it. I don't remember anybody else doing it. I just remember it was kind of an evening. It was a night service. I know that much. It wasn't morning.
That's cool.
And so, because of football. And I went down front and I asked Jesus into my life, and then we did the meeting, and then sure enough later on at a night service, I think once a month they had baptisms, and I got baptized. And back then they didn't let you tell your story or explain it to you, just they brought you down. They said, "This is Greg, he said he wanted to follow Jesus." And it's over with. It was weird because I didn't like you, unlike you. Nothing really changed. I didn't get I got a good for you, son, and proud of you, dad. And again, I want to say again, my mom and dad did the best they could with me, but there wasn't just something pervasive in their lives. It was what we did. For me, it was more than that. Yeah. It was so much more than just what I did. It was something that I knew defined me different now.
Yeah.
But I was still a 13-year-old at this point who had just gone through this transition that made everything soft and curly haired around me look really, really interesting and in different ways than it had before. And along with that, the social pressures that came with high school, we didn't have middle school. Middle school is this strange, literally the school systems have created purgatory for kids. Right. And I don't know why we would do that. Yeah, put them in purgatory where they don't know which way they're going. And so I didn't have that. I just went straight to high school. It was called sub-freshman when I was a year. 8th grade, it was a sub-freshman. And all I knew was that I was going to find senior ring imprints all over the top of my head. And I was going to get beat senseless. And I joined the football team in order to prove myself because, again, I was making decisions because of what people expected of me. Yeah. And I was expected to be a football player. And so they made me an offensive lineman. I was mad because I was faster than the fullback. And I was able to hit harder. But he said, "But you're big." And so I was big enough to hit things and did. I wasn't in football long, and then I became a choir guy. But the whole point is that through all that time, I'm seeking to impress people, but I'm having this internal wrestling match that says, this isn't who you are. You're not someone who needs to be. And of course, I can still remember one of my friends, I think it was my friend, pulling me aside and said, "Greg, you just need to be you." And I can still remember looking at this guy going, who is that?
What does that mean?
What does that even mean? You're asking a 15-year-old to know who he is, and he's looking at you like, just be yourself. Who might that be? I was told myself was to be football. I was told I was to be, I enjoyed choir. I enjoyed singing. I enjoyed performing. That was all things I knew that were who I was. But there was something in the interpersonal relationships that was just trying to be something for others, what they thought I was supposed to be.
Yeah, you talked about your genuine wrestling match, though, with were you supposed to be tough or were you supposed to be kind of soft because you were in choir and all that?
Yeah, and I told you my family was of that generation that just said, suck it up. My dad's hero was John Wayne. My mother's hero was my dad, I guess. And but
no wonder you had a wrestling match.
If I ever had an emotional moment, it was suck it up, kid. And that was my parents.
I was going to say your mom was more that way than your dad, I think.
My mom would not be one you would consider to go to for comfort. Mom would be like, "Do you need a hug?" What? We don't do that. And so I was a softer, tenderer kind, and it wasn't a genetic thing. My brother and I both were adopted. So there was also that uncertainty where we came from, and no, that didn't affect my identity. I didn't even care. But I was wrestling with what that meant to be who I was supposed to be. Now, continuing all this time to go to church. Funniest thing ever to me remembering was I go to church on Sunday with the same people I was out drinking with on Saturday night.
Eek.
And we'd all be sitting in the circle. Some of them would be in better shape than others based upon their tolerance. I seem to never have an issue with the shape I was in. I was always in a good place, in a good mood, and ready to engage church. And I still was just enamored that there's something more. Okay. I began along the journey to have this sense that God was whispering to me. And I don't want to say that there was this audible voice, but I will tell you that there was something audible. Mm-hmm. And it was just always this sense that you are to help people, you're to serve people. There's something about giving yourself away. I don't even know how to
so
really.
Real to you
it was
that it
so
was
flippant and real to me, and it's not. I want to make it real sure that you understand. Wasn't this like
booming
experience that's booming, but it was this just nagging.
The Bible calls it a still small voice.
Yeah, it didn't seem still or small. It may have been quiet, but it was just
knocking in the back of your head.
Yeah. Well, because I'm judging myself by my peers, and my peers are doing way better at all the things I thought I should be doing good because I'm a teenager, and I didn't have this parent that was saying, "Son, you're going to be okay. Suck it up." I had a parent saying,
"Yeah, that part.
Suck it up. You'll be okay." But the emphasis wasn't on understanding where I was at in the struggle. The emphasis was on just power through.
Yeah.
And so I was powering through. And it's interesting to really just kind of deep dive into this a little bit, doing my own counseling service here. But there was always this sense that there was something more. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend like, I had this great calling where that in a moment it all became clear to me. Like I said, it was always this thing that was going in stupid things. I accidentally I decided at one point, because I started going to other youth groups. This was another thing. And I went to other youth groups for the most noblest reasons that any young man can go to other youth groups.
To meet girls.
Well, no, I had already met the girls.
Oh, okay.
I just
to follow the
was
girls.
Following them there. Yeah. You shouldn't beat me to the punchline like that.
Sorry. I thought I would.
That was good. Well, you just know.
Wink
you know
at
me.
you.
Yeah. Wink, wink. Yeah. I can't say that it wasn't when I looked across the room at you that I wasn't sitting at a mission thing going, some good looking girls here. Again, there is this thing that God made all men to go,
yeah,
hey.
I got you.
So I was sitting there at one youth group, and I heard a different minister other than mine. And I said already, the pastors of my church were my heroes. And the same thing was true. They just seemed like there was something solid about them. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to know what that was and how that was. And now that I've lived a few years, I know all ministers aren't solid. They all got together. As a matter of fact, most of them are just kind of struggling along like the rest of us, and they have their ups and their downs. But for a young man, seeing that, those pastors and the girls that were there to be chased, that's fine. I don't remember any of their names. Some of them came and went, but
my
I never caught any
thoughts
of them,
on that is you must have saw a depth in these men that you weren't able to see other places.
Yeah, there was something more, and again, so I say all that to say, meanwhile, I'm going out on Saturday nights and Friday nights, and I'm trying to fit in with the larger crowd. I'm drinking, and I should be dead so many times over for the dumb things that I did.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
and I wasn't good at any of it. I was just being dumb. But I can still remember even one time I was helping a girl. This is stupid. Helping a girl throw up in the bushes, realizing along the line that I was kind of sick myself. And it wasn't from that. I had been around it, and I didn't realize I'd been drinking because someone had spiked the punch. But during that time I was helping her, again, I heard that voice, that sense that you're going to be helping people. You're going to be doing this. And it was just at that point in time, so was I drinking and therefore I had a moment? No, it was a consistent thing that happened no matter. And I think of the psalmist that says, if I go in the darkness of Sheol, or if I'm in the highest of heavens, there you are. It doesn't matter where you are. God can speak to you. And I think he does.
Oh, yeah,
but I again want to say it wasn't like there was this audible voice going, Greg. It was a sense.
Yeah.
It isn't, and it was. I was sitting here. I literally said before we started this, I don't want to make it so spiritual that nobody ever thinks they can do it. But for me, it was. There was just something real about it.
But I think what you're trying to say by that is not for everyone to search for this big, literal burning bush, experience. However, the Bible's very clear that you're going to hear his voice. Even like you were referencing last time we talked in Romans 1 about how his attributes are we have no excuse. We see his attributes everywhere. God says he has shown us himself. So we may see it, we may hear it, we may know it, but he lets us know. He calls us because his voice is what's the word? I don't know. Hearable. It's knowable. It's
knowable.
Yeah.
We can know his voice. Jesus said that. He said, "My
Yeah.
sheep know my voice."
Exactly.
I get into that because I want us to transition to the larger calling. So I became a Christian when I was 12. I was baptized when I was 12. I really struggle with staying on the path because of my adolescent desires and needs.
Mm-hmm.
But the story I told about the girl and throwing up in the bushes was relevant in the sense that it was my senior year, and I'd sworn off that I was no longer going to drink because I was going to try and figure out what God wanted for my life. It was my senior year of high school. I was nervous about the future. I didn't know what was coming up next. My grades weren't the greatest because I was doing those other things I mentioned. And so what I did was, that's why I was surprised that I was inebriated at the party. Someone had spiked the punch. I wasn't trying to, but
Yeah,
God found me even in that
that,
moment and
yes.
reminded me, and he drove me home that night, and we won't get into that.
Mm-hmm.
But there was the question of what was God asking of my life? What am I going to do from graduation on? So I'm in a crisis at this moment. I know what's going on. And I mentioned that we had annual youth choir trips, and we would go up to Gatlinburg, Tennessee, to a retreat center up there, and we would spend a week in a barn-looking place with the choir director teaching us a thing. And I went there, and I wanted to answer that question. So I spent, and again, I was not just a singer at school. I was a singer at church. I was a singer in high school. I was doing classical training. I had voice lessons. I kind of knew I wanted to be a musician at that point. I'm thinking rock star, right? Because, well, I'm a teenager again. And so I was pursuing the dream of the music that God had put in me. I just didn't know it at the time. And so I went out and I walked in. I went barefoot and stepped on a
Got
D.
stung by a bee.
A D.
This is how God uses everything, including negative things,
Oh,
right?
man, it hurt so bad. And so I wound up being allowed to miss some meetings because I found that standing in that ice cold water coming down off the mountain
Yeah, the stream
was just
that was
numbing to
coming.
my feet. So my choir director said, "You just come to the meetings and then go out and you can walk." So I walked up and down a stream for 5 days and just sang and prayed, and prayed through song. And I think I just sang like Amazing Grace over and over, but just made up the words. And I just remember because that's what I did, right? In those moments, I finally surrendered to God. That up on a hill, laying on a rock, I just said, "Lord, it's enough. I know you want to follow. I want to follow you. I believe now that those ministers, those people that I look to, were not because I want to be like them when I grow up. I believe that God was showing me what I was going to be when I grew up. I just didn't know how to process that at the time.
Yeah.
They were definitely influences, and they were definitely." What's the word I'm looking for?
Mentors.
They were mentors,
right?
but I mean, I can look back on several of them now and like going, I don't know, I'd follow that guy if I knew what I knew about him now, or what. And what I mean by that is not to degrade the ministry, just theologically we've parted ways. We have different views on things.
But you saw in them something that God was putting in your own heart, and He wanted you to see.
God showed me His priesthood for whatever, or showed me the people, and He said, "This is where you're supposed to be." I gave in to that on that mountain that night, and I had a religious experience. I had the sense of flame coming down from heaven above. Didn't see anything like that. I would just say it this way: I couldn't move. I was overwhelmed with presence.
Yeah. God's presence.
And one of the biggest questions that I had, also being very deep and emotional about wanting to connect with God, was, "God, I want to follow you, but you need to comfort me that there will be some fun." And God, not being mocked, made this a moment that actually turned out to be pretty fun. And that's a story. And I'll tell it quick. There was a person coming up the hill with our pastor of the time, Pastor Songer, Jerry Songer, and she was telling him about the Night of the Living Dead. Because that's what you talk to your pastor about
when you're in the dark walking up a mountain.
And I'm sitting there thinking, as I can hear them walking in the distance, I'm starting, and it's to hold me going, "What's that they're talking about? Are they talking about zombie? What is this?" And so, and by the way, back then there was Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead. There was, in the 80s, there was only 2 of them. I know there was maybe 3 or 4, but I only knew 2. And I was starting to laugh to myself because, why is she telling him this? So she's getting ahead, and I hear her start to say, "What is that up ahead? Who's up there?" And I was wearing a white shirt. I didn't know that. I mean, I probably did know that, but I was wearing a white shirt, and I'm laying on this rock, and I can't move. And I'm just thinking, that's funny. I don't know what's going to come of this. But as she got closer and closer and closer, finally just kind of saying, what's that? What's that? I just rolled my head over and I said, hi, Madeline, which was the name of the person. But what I think came out was more along the lines of, and she lost her sensibilities and turned around and almost destroyed the pastor, running over him to get down the hill and screaming because she had talked herself into that tizzy. And when I turned over and could barely talk, and the pastor walked over and said, Greg, is that you? He didn't freak out. Another reason that ministers were my role model. They didn't lose their mind in the face of fiction, like we do in our modern culture.
I think the coolest part of that story is the next day you saw that actually the rock you were laying on was an altar, right?
Yeah, you just loved my punchlines, don't you?
Yeah, I do.
Well, that's probably because I'd cry if I told it anyway. But yeah, the next day I didn't realize it because, again, it was dark. It was nighttime. I wasn't paying attention. I went up that hill again, and it was a cross that said that, it was a sacrificial rock, and it was the cross, and I'd laid myself down on an altar. And see, I can't. Not everybody may have an experience like that, a religious moment. I wasn't doing mushrooms. I hadn't eaten anything natural. But there was a moment there, and I can count on one hand times where, and it was in that moment too. I didn't hear God's voice and nag and whisper like that, like I'd been hearing all along. But there was a sense of, oh, like the light came on. It's like this is what he meant, and it wasn't the emotional experience. I'm emotional about it now, and I always have been whenever I tell that story, just like when I tell the story of how I knew you were the one that I was supposed to marry. There was a sense of deep sense of
peace or
knowing,
awe or something.
Peace. Yeah. There's something that's there. It is not emotions may accompany it.
Yeah.
Experience may accompany it. But whatever it is that God does in your heart does not easily uproot. When the Bible talks about oaks and trees of righteousness and planting, and those metaphors are there to say God's will is not undone. There may be a bunch of people running around claiming that it is, and their experiences weren't enough. Well, then what are you putting your faith in? Are you putting your faith in an experience?
Yeah.
Now, I want to say that because that's the second aspect of what we wanted to talk about, is calling, as it is specific to a vocation. There was a lot going on in my life, and I want to track back through that really quickly to say something that may or may not apply to the listener. I have, in the course of this deconstruction, seen that God had me seeing things along the way that gave me a vocation that I also was to have. First and foremost, as a follower of Jesus, we are all called to share the gospel. We're all called to call people to Jesus.
Witnesses,
so
right.
Whether I'm a Christian pastor or not, that exists. That's an underlying
truth.
A witness
because
that's
you
the
are
obvious
a
call,
witness.
right? That's the obvious call.
It's your identity.
But for me as a young man, also I was, I think, fortunate in that God also chose and called me and showed me through the course of events in my life and that nagging in my heart that I was going to be doing what I'm doing today. Caring for others, pastoring, teaching, and bringing people and growing them and discipling them in Jesus, and getting to sing a song now and again because I still did do the music training. But those things are all something that God used along the way to shape me for His vocational call or for His call, and that's kind of where I think I want to say is. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to add on to that. So it's kind of similar to me in that sense that I had music in my background as well. My parents and family sing, and all of my mother's family have had various groups, normally Southern gospel type groups out of them. So music was dear and near, and it was but mine was an angle on worship that I don't think I ever completely understood and still don't, that God had put in my heart very young as well. So there's a sense of God's presence when I encounter maybe music. So there's a combination of that. But He used some of that to take me towards where He would call me, but it wasn't the complete, just like with you and what I've experienced with you anyway. Music kind of got you going that direction. The call of God was on your heart. It was for your life. It became a sense of how you would live out your life, right? But not necessarily. Music was like a piece of it. It was like an edge on it. Same with me. But when I was 10 and when I was at camp, and I sensed that my life would be given over to whatever he would take me into. It was a, from my perspective, a missions calling, a calling to go and do and be, like you're saying, in a ministry setting. Since I don't even know how to describe it these days, because it seemed as if it would be vocationally then, not just an identity of a witness of who Jesus is and what he is about, but also in a sense of this is going to be the rest of my life. So
we both had an understanding that life was, we were going to be doing this for life, and it was going to be the primary thing that we do. I really want to just make a semicolon parentheses here and say, what is it that God's shaping in your life? When you're trying to figure out where you are supposed to be and what you're supposed to do, the thought that that I want to say, because we're two preacher type people with ministry callings, but I think the process is similar. I think God works in all of us to put a passion in our heart that's unique to who you are. It could be,
that's a good way to put it.
Jesus woodworked before he was called to ministry, but Paul made tents. We all had some vocational things. Their underlying thing became, in Paul's case, the underlying thing became his vocation. But that's a different culture and a different time. I think for us, as we look at it today, we need to understand that God brings about events and desires and passions and things in your life that shape what will eventually be how maybe you're expressing that call. Now, I don't want to be so general so that you can make it anything. It's got to be consistent with what he would call you to do. But it could be very well that he calls you to do something. I referenced before that some people have left high-profile jobs to go after passions. Like I've got a friend of mine who was in the ministry also, who left the ministry and wound up doing youth ministry for a time, but then found himself passionate when he got involved in an outreach to help stop sex trafficking overseas of children. Yeah. And now he works exclusively for that group. He's become extremely passionate. He wasn't terribly happy in the ministry, but he spent his entire adult life since then. When he found that groove, I just didn't sense anything but joy in him to be a part of that rescue mission.
Yeah. But then we've also known men who have, or even women, who have had a specific calling, like to business. We knew a man who felt called to businessmen. Really and so he knew he'd have to own a business and have some of that in order to get on kind of the level of businessmen, because he wanted to share and be a minister to businessmen. So I thought that was really unique.
Super good example.
All kinds of callings that God, and so like you're saying, individuals called first to just answer the calling. Jesus said, "Follow me," and then second, when he in the scriptures he sent out the 75 to some different towns, or the disciples were called to a specific kind of ministry that was surrounding Jesus. And you can kind of sense that there was different allocations. Like we know Paul was called, really his calling from my perspective would be he planted a few churches, but he also wrote so much of what we would consider God's word to us as believers to understand, maybe what Jesus taught when he was on this planet. So his calling was to write down the truths or the explanations. But there's so many different angles on that. I guess what I was trying to say, I think maybe a key for people who are looking for that, for you and I both, there was a sense of at one point or another, God showed us a particular verse or a couple of verses that would kind of be a life
linchpin.
Yeah, a life theme. Maybe that's the way to put it. I think, and I've heard a lot of different people. I would actually even say I know kind of what my mom's was. Hers is, from what I understand, the way she's taught us, Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, is what her life has been about. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not to your own understanding, but in all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. So you can tell from that scripture, it's not specifically go this way, do this thing. It's trust in me always. I'm going to lead your path, that kind of, and don't worry about your own understanding because it's going to be confusing at times. Well, for me, mine was 2 Corinthians 4, 5, and 6, and it's come back often throughout my life. I don't even remember the exact time. I had this special Bible at one time, which I could go into, and it was so cool when I believe the Bible kind of jumped off the pages at me and became God's word in my heart, kind of thing. So it could have been when I had that particular Bible. But but I knew this would be what my life was going to my life goal, maybe, or a theme. Anyway, 2 Corinthians 4, 5, and 6. For we are not proclaiming, we don't proclaim ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord, and myself your servant or your slave because of Jesus. For God, who said, let light shine out of the darkness, He shone in my heart to give me the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. So that was a theme that He put in my heart to be. And of course, there's so many other scriptures that are special to me, but that somehow rang to be, for me, to hang on to angle my life toward, or whatever. And then you have
Colossians 2:6.
Always been, yeah.
Because when I was in seminary, someone set me aside and just kind of drew me to the basics. And Colossians 2:6 says, just as you received Christ Jesus as Lord, continue in Him, rooted and built up in Him, and established in the faith, just as you were taught, overflowing with gratitude. But just as you received Christ Jesus as Lord, made me throw back, and He just pushed that. I said, what do you mean, just as I asked Him into my life? I didn't know. But then He made me throw back and say, what was your state of mind at the time? And I'm like, dude, I was 12. But the thing that stuck with me was not so much that, but what it was when I was called to the ministry. Mm-hmm. And that's why it became such for me, because I was helpless. I didn't have a clue what I was going to do with my life, where I was going to go. There was a bit of crisis in that. Mm-hmm. I had a college worked out. I mean, it was not like I was not going to figure it out as I went along. But as I've learned with raising my own college age kids, you can kind of be kind of crazy about that kind of stuff with your life.
He kind of wanted you to never lose sight of what you knew.
Yeah,
at that very early age.
I needed to be reminded that was the basic. I was desperately needed Jesus to give me things. I think we live in a world where people are wanting, Jesus to fill their coffee cup for them, and serve them, which He would do if He was here. And if He doesn't fill this cup with water right now, or coffee right now, then He's not answering my prayers. I think we need to have a bigger view of God than that. Yeah. And that God, I didn't understand what the heck that man was doing with me when He put me there. And He said, Colossians 2:6 says this, what does it mean? And I'm going, I don't know, I was 12. But now I look back on it, I'm going, it's been the foundational, never lose sight of the fact that you desperately need Jesus. Yeah. And as soon as I do, I'm done. Yeah. Because that's when I accept the lie of the Garden of Eden, and I get to be my own judge, because I decide I'll make my own decisions. And God goes in, welcome to the Garden of Sin. And we slip into that now and again, but that's why I need to be reminded that Jesus is what's important. So I
think for me, He wanted me to know that the servant part would always be about Him, not about myself. I don't want to serve others because I'm going to, like we were talking last podcast, I think, about philanthropic goods. And, I want to be good. I want to do something for somebody. Yeah, I probably, in reality, want those accolades or whatever. But if I'm serving because I'm not going to proclaim myself, I'm going to proclaim Jesus, then whatever I serve in His name, that's going to be my prayer.
Well, I might
other part of that is God said, light will shine out of the darkness. He shone in my heart. He showed me Jesus. He lit up my heart. So therefore, anything I want to do, I want to show what He has shown to me about Jesus and who He is.
Right. Well, in the accolades business, I might feed the homeless because it makes me feel good. But I'm not going to go into a region in a country where I might lose my life because it's not going to make me feel good. Yeah. If I lose my life, but I preach the gospel, as we learned from, Elliot,
Jim Elliot.
Jim Elliot, thank you. He didn't see the fruit of that sacrifice.
Yeah.
And I really, really think that people need to understand that we're not in this life for us. We are loved by Christ, and we are chosen by Christ, and we are called by Christ to do the basic thing, to offer the freedom that comes with getting set free from our sin. Mm-hmm. But we are not
called to lay our own selves down.
The calling is to be like Jesus, which means to set ourselves aside, confident that our Father will take care of us so that we can take care of others.
And it's funny because I think we can segue maybe even to the next podcast and talk about what that looks like in marriage. Because I believe my calling was going to be on foreign fields, and so Instead, when I got married, there was some things about that I had to change, that I had to realize, okay, laying my life down may not mean I'm in the middle of, some genocide in Africa and being whatever, but I may be laying my life down in order that my husband can do what he's called to do, or whatever. Those are things we could get into, but
sure, let's do that. We can do that next time. I'm pretty sure we're probably well over time we would have normally spent here anyway. So we're going to call it quits again and just dive out of here. What?
And then talk about, wasn't there a third calling that you wanted to talk about? Like you were saying, there was like 5 different callings you said.
No, I said there's bullet points, which are indefinite in number, depending on when I run out of things to say.
Okay,
and
gotcha.
then we go, that's how books are written. Then you go back and you say, there are 5 things. And the people read the book, go, God, this guy thought there was 5 things and he figured it all out. But no, he just wrote a lot of stuff down. They went back and counted them. There's 5 of them. Okay, that's what I come up with. And then somebody comes along and says, no, dude, there's 6. So anyway, thanks for listening to Ask Mom and Dad. And whether you asked this question or not, I hope you learned something. And again, this podcast is brought to you by the Holy Spirit, because we don't know what we're going to say. We're just trusting He'll say it for us. Thanks for listening. Bye now.
Keep on.